Always fun when we get to bring Rece Davis on the channel, Coach, and excited to hear where we're at halfway through this college football season.
Yeah, couldn't have a better time to have Rece with Georgia and Texas playing, game day going there, and that'll be a big part of our show today. But Rece, you've been going transcontinental, and your voice has finally come back here. But we just want to talk to you about a little bit about going to the West Coast and seeing the Ducks beat the Ohio State Buckeyes.
One of the best games of the season, Jim, and I think it's two teams that can win the national championship. In my judgment, Ohio State still has the better roster, but Oregon has the better quarterback. And I don't mean that to cast aspersions at Will Howard, who I think is a really good player. But I'm a big Dylan Gabriel believer, and I think he's a guy that can he's got sort of big play DNA. And he can compensate for some weaknesses. He's kind of fearless. He doesn't mind turning the ball loose down the field. And, it was a huge, huge win for Lanning and the Ducks, I think, to pull that one out. Not detrimental to Ohio State's hopes by any stretch of the imagination. But to me, and I'm waiting to see if Georgia is in this category as I thought they were in the preseason. And I still think they probably are. But to me, Texas, Ohio State, and Oregon have set themselves apart, and I suspect that Georgia's in that group as well. And but I guess we'll find out a lot about that this weekend. But the Oregon-Ohio State game, I hope that Georgia and Texas can be as entertaining as that one was.
Yeah, I mean, when you got that SEC thing with ESPN, they should have gotten you a bonus because you definitely they got some big games, man. I tell you, over and over, certainly. And the fact that you're going to be there, we'll be talking about a little bit about the logistics of it. But also, just hit us up one more team in the Big Ten. What's your take on Penn State?
I think they're really good, and I've put a lot of stock in their win at West Virginia. And I know that West Virginia has lost more than perhaps many thought they would. But I thought that was a really difficult environment that they went into. And then they went into the Coliseum against a USC team that is talented, but a little bit desperate. And going into the weekend, Big Ten teams against power conference opponents that had traveled 2 or more time zones were 1-10. The only victory was Indiana beating UCLA. And that was prior to this weekend. There were a couple this weekend. So I thought that the Penn State win was a really good one. Be interested to see what you think. I think it was at least aided to some degree by Lincoln Riley, taking his timeouts home to be able to use them to wax his surfboard at Manhattan Beach or to use in some, secret weekend chili recipe or whatever. But, he decided to try to run it down, and it ended up costing them a chance to win in regulation, I thought. Maybe they throw the interception earlier and they lose in regulation, but I didn't think they gave themselves the maximum number of opportunities to win that game. But that said, I thought it was a really good win for Penn State, and I think they're really good on defense. They got new coordinators on both sides of the ball, and Andy Kotelnicki coming over from Kansas has given them a big play dimension that they really haven't had in a few years. So I don't know that I think they're as good as the other two in the Big Ten, but I certainly believe they're a playoff team and capable of winning a game, against either Oregon or Ohio State.
Yeah, and don't they have Ohio State at home? Or
they do. They have Ohio State at home. They don't play Oregon in the regular season, so that'll be a pretty significant game because, again, I don't think it eliminates Ohio State, but you're sort of like Alabama 2 years ago when Alabama didn't make the playoff when they had the overtime loss to LSU and the last second loss to Tennessee. They probably were one of the 4 best teams, but part of being the best is what your resume says, and the best point on your resume can't be a close loss. And so that Ohio State could fall into that category if win over Iowa's nice, but if they don't win at Penn State, and if Michigan continues to struggle, and if they don't wind up, and if they lose both those games, they probably won't, I wouldn't think, wind up in the Big Ten championship game. I'm not saying they won't make it. Don't misunderstand. They probably will, but they will be at risk, much in the same way that Georgia will be. If Georgia doesn't win Saturday, I'm not saying they won't make it. if they don't win Saturday, but they certainly will be. They will bring being left out into the equation, just as Ohio State could theoretically, should it not be able to win at Penn State.
Good point there. And then the other thing before we get into Texas here is the ACC. You were out on the West Coast for the Cal game against Miami, and you kept up. Clemson certainly has been on a winning trek, but really hasn't played that many good teams. But looks like that's a two-way race there in the ACC too.
Yeah, I think so. I was looking at this, Jim. I'm referring to my notes because I remembered that I had looked this up earlier today about Clemson, and I picked them to win the ACC, and I still think they will. And I do think they're good, and I think they're playing better. But in this 5-game winning streak, since they got thumped by Georgia, it's against teams that are 3-11 in ACC play. Now Virginia's played well, and Tony Elliott coming back will, be a different kind of, maybe a little bit of an upgrade and challenge for them this week. I do think Clemson is good, and they're playing better, and they're getting better. So I do believe that they and Miami are the two best teams in the ACC. As it pertains to the Hurricanes, sometimes when you win championships, you need a game or two, like the last two that Miami has had. And they've gotten breaks. There's no two ways around it. The Virginia Tech game, the play in the back of the end zone, in my judgment, I don't like the way replay was applied there because I did not see indisputable video evidence. However, that said, I think the result was closer to right than the call on the field. So I'm not trying to double talk there. I would prefer the call on the field stand and that they only use replay to overturn calls when it is absolutely 100% clear. But at least if you want to take some consolation from that, I think the call was closer to right than the touchdown in the back of the end zone. The Miami Cal game was, in my judgment, and according to some prominent former officials who reached out to me after the game, was an egregious miss of targeting on Mendoza, which would have given Cal a first down. They might have been able to run out the clock. And even if they hadn't been able to run out the clock, because I'd have to look back and refresh my memory about how many timeouts Miami had left. But even if they weren't, it would have put Miami really in dire straits when they got the ball back in terms of time. That said, it's really good to have Cam Ward at quarterback to erase any problems like that, because he is sensational. And I think because of that, Miami has a chance to beat anybody it were to match up against.
Okay, Dayne.
Yeah, Rece, in the next 6 weeks, your life definitely becomes college football playoff rankings and trying to recalibrate what all of that means in a new expanded system. So I ask you, based on that, what does a loss mean right now?
It depends on who you're talking about. I mean, they're not as debilitating as they were in the past, but I think a second loss, as I sort of, alluded to with Ohio State, should it suffer one, they haven't yet, obviously, or should Georgia suffer a second one in one of these, two huge road games that they have coming up here against Texas this weekend and Ole Miss in a few weeks, it brings it into the equation, depending on what else happens around them. So I think I think it all depends on the circumstance. If you look at this and kind of get way down in the weeds here, but Texas A&M's undefeated and atop the SEC, and their schedule has broken right for them. They've got LSU at home, and then they end the regular season against Texas. They have a couple of road games that could be construed as tricky, going to South Carolina, going to Auburn. But it's a much easier schedule than say, the one that Georgia faces. So I bring this up to say I think a loss for a team like Texas A&M that has that type of schedule, to take it out of the SEC, a team like Indiana, which I love the way they're playing. I mean, Kurt Cignetti's doing an unbelievable job, but their strength of schedule is ranked 112th. They've played precious few teams up to this point. In fact, I think Nebraska is the first team they played or will play this weekend that currently holds a winning record. So losses for those teams, and I have faith that the committee will evaluate it this way. is going to be more damaging than, say, a loss by Georgia, which is playing, a brutal schedule. I even think that in some ways you could say a loss by Ohio State is different because they've got a couple of, really, really tough road games, but they didn't have anything in the non-conference. And, it's just kind of, I think a lot of it in terms of just answering your question about what does a loss mean, it depends on the rest of your schedule. If the rest of your schedule is, significantly easier, and look, I'm not talking 10 spots difference. I don't know what the number is, but there's a strength of schedule ranking that, if somebody's 32 and someone's 42, I don't know how much of a difference that makes. But if someone's 32 and someone's 112, well, then that's different. So I think if you have a significant difference in the strength of your schedule, then a loss can certainly be more damaging than it would be to a team who's playing, a much more difficult schedule.
Definitely handle that one pretty well. I definitely couldn't answer that with that kind of aptitude. So let's go on to one more conference here. Big 12, got BYU and Iowa State. Before the season started, if you'd have said both of these teams have been undefeated, really beat Cronic the Magnificent. So what do you think about these two teams, and can they really be on a national scale? I mean, are they both capable of playing with these others?
I think the question for me about Iowa State has been, how will they play in close games? And the last 3 seasons coming into this year, they had been 1-6 in games decided by 4 points or fewer. They had lost 13 of their last 16 one-score games. Now, they've only had one of those this year, but it was a huge one, and it was one they almost always found a way to lose, and it was against Iowa. And they won that game by 1 point. But they led the nation coming into the season in returning production. I think their quarterback, Rocco Beck, is a really, really good player. They've got 3 running backs, all of whom have had around 50 or 60 carries on the season, all of whom have had big moments, and all of whom average 5 yards a carry. Have a couple of big play receivers. And even though they've had some injuries at linebacker, they continue to play the great defense that they always play in Jim Haycock. So I think Iowa State's the best team in the Big 12, although I've said that I think the Big 12 is wide, not deep, meaning that I don't see teams that have this enormously high ceiling. But I think all of them are, for the most part, pretty good teams. And so you're going to have a lot of upsets, people knocking off each other. I also think BYU is getting better and better. And the team that nobody's paying attention to, and I've been trying to make sure I get them in more, is Texas Tech. Texas Tech didn't have Taj Brooks, their best player. They lost to Wazoo, and everybody sort of said, okay, well, whatever. Well, they haven't lost a conference game. And in fact, the Wazoo game's the only game they've lost. So they're another team. I think all of those teams are very similar. If you have a rough day, you're going to lose. If you run into a buzzsaw for 10 minutes, as Kansas State did at BYU, you're going to lose. If you let Shedeur Sanders start spinning bean on you, you're going to lose. So there's nobody that can overcome, all of those things necessarily to run the table. So I think everybody's going to have a loss or two. But the more Iowa State takes care of business and the more it seems they improve, the more likely it might be that they only come out of there with one loss. I don't know that I can envision a scenario where they don't step on a rake and hit themselves in the face somewhere. But, I think they might prove to be the best team of the bunch up to this, or once the season is complete, they might prove to be the best team.
Okay, moving on to Georgia and Texas, and certainly a big matchup, and you guys will be in there Friday, maybe Thursday night. But just everybody knows about Georgia on this site, but I'm going to ask your opinion of them in a minute. But this Texas team, to me, has certainly got a lot of firepower and a lot of good players, but for sure has not been tested schedule-wise. I would think that 4 or 5 teams in our league playing that same schedule would have the identical record more than likely, wouldn't you think?
Probably the same record. I don't know if they would look quite as good doing it. I think Texas is really good. And I think with a week to knock off the rust and to get back in shape, that Quinn Ewers is going to be what we saw at Michigan. And I mean, my goodness. I mean, Michigan has a lot of guys back on defense, and he absolutely filleted them. And I think he is a terrific quarterback. You know that Sark might be the best play caller in college football. And and not only play caller, because that's probably too much of a shorthand thing, but designing, scheming, getting the matchup he wants, playing to his players' strengths, all of those things, he's elite. And I think it's going to be quite a challenge for them. But on the other side, Texas hasn't seen anybody like Georgia or like Carson Beck. I mean, think about this, guys. In their 3 games against Power 4 opponents, they've seen a former walk-on quarterback making his second career start and 2 true freshmen. 4 of their 6 opponents this season have passing offenses that are ranked below 100 in the country, and the best passing offense they have seen up to this point is UTSA. So, look, I believe in Texas, but they haven't seen anything like what Carson Beck and the boys are going to bring to town. Now, I do have questions about Georgia at wide receiver in terms of consistency. Arian Smith is certainly dynamic in speed. Dylan Bell is a player I really like. But in terms of guys who really scare you to death and you are pretty confident will make you pay every time, I don't see it. But even so, Carson's still throwing for 450 yards. He finds somebody to catch it. So I think this will be a different type of test for Texas. So everybody that I'm sort of getting this vibe or undercurrent that people are going, oh, Texas behemoth, and they're kind of like, oh, Georgia can't get it together. And that's sort of when I break into on the show to, oh, poor old Georgia. Oh, feel bad for poor old Georgia. They're just going to go down, take the trip to Austin and see if they can get a first down. Better watch out. I mean, I don't think the Dogs have played their potential yet, and I think they've got an opportunity to do so this weekend and really make a statement.
How would Larry say that?
And the Dogs, and they're not giving us a chance when we go down there and say we're just going to go down and get run over by Bevo.
Hey, you got it. That's great.
Hey, Rece, it was evident that when you all went to Cal that was just so much fun for the College Game Day team, and I think I've even heard you talk about it since then. With more teams seemingly being involved in just the postseason process here, even halfway through the season and prognosticating, are there other stories out there similar that you have your eyes on, maybe a Vanderbilt or even Army and Navy, what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, Vanderbilt's a good story. I don't think that I don't think they'll be around for the playoff at the end, but I mean, it's Vanderbilt. So, and the way they're winning, having beaten Alabama, beaten Virginia Tech, beaten Kentucky after beating Alabama, to sort of say, you think that was a fluke? Think not. They'll get Texas next week after Texas has had the rivalry game with Oklahoma and the latest showdown of the century against Georgia. So they're catching them at a good time. It's a great story. And it also shows great adaptability by Clark Lee and open-mindedness and, looking at it and going, wait a minute, how, Auburn throttled us last year and then New Mexico State goes in and spanks them. What do they got going there? And, he looks at the quarterback, he looks at the OC, he looks at Jerry Kill, and they bring him in. And the tight end Stowers, who's a former quarterback, he's going to play in the NFL. And, that understanding that offense has really helped them. Are they on the level of Texas or Georgia? No. Should Alabama have lost that game? No. But they're still very much improved and they're dangerous. And it's a great story and great to see. The Army Navy thing is fascinating to me. The idea that they could play in the championship game for the American Conference and then play in America's game, the next week and really not have it mean anything other than what it always means for Army and Navy to play. I don't know that there's anything that's underscored the new era of college football more so than that. But it's a really interesting thing, and I not to give away too much, but I think Nick in the film room segment is going to take a little look at the wrinkles this week that Navy has brought around with their new offensive coordinator, Drew Cronic, who I know you guys are familiar with, from his, his head coach at Lenore Ryan, head coach at Mercer, and now as the OC at Navy. And this quarterback they have, Blake Horvath, is he's fun to watch. And he calls it, they have some wing T principles. They still run some dive option stuff, but there's more motion. He calls it sort of a sling T kind of thing. So there's still option. There's still the things that you identify with Navy, but there are a lot of different wrinkles and motions and passing and different things that have really made them explosive. And, I think it's really a good thing. And Monken's added some different things to his Army attack too. So both those teams are very good, but they haven't, sort of like in keeping with some of the other teams we've talked about, they haven't played, the most difficult of schedules up to this point.
Yeah, it looks kind of weird to see both these teams in the shotgun, but still running option principles.
Yeah.
One quick story on Drew. He was a walk-on for me and played at Georgia, and we were playing in the Outback Bowl, and he was a wide receiver. And he said, "Coach, I need to get the ball." And I said, "We're not going to throw the ball. The game's over. We're not going to run it up." He said, "Well, put me in at tailback." I said, "Okay." He weighed about 160, and we ran 42 power or something like that. And he hit it up in there like a shot, man. And one of these linebackers hit him, and he bounced off and everything. But he just wanted to touch the ball one time in that Outback Bowl. His dad was a high school coach, and he's really done a terrific job. I mean, going to Furman and working his way up, and I'm so proud of him. But
you know what, Jim? I met him. I have a quick story about Drew from this year. I met him a few years ago. I did a speaking engagement in Hickory, North Carolina, when he was at Lenore Ryan. Got his phone number. I wouldn't say we didn't really keep in touch or anything, but we, maybe immediately afterwards, we hadn't touched base with him in a while. And I really needed a super dog win on the show. I didn't tell him this, but I texted him on Friday before they played Memphis, and because I was going with Navy because of the offense, and I was like, how are we feeling about how things are sizing up against Memphis? Radio silence. I get nothing. I'm like, oh, well, okay, maybe his number changed. It's been a while. Didn't hear a thing. So go through the game. Navy wins. Absolutely eviscerated Memphis's defense, right? I came back home that week, and I watched the end of the Memphis Navy game, and a couple hours after the game's over, my phone buzzes, and it's him. And he says, "Hey, man," he goes, "I didn't think this was really you." He said, "I thought it was somebody from Memphis trying to get some information out of me." He said, "Then I heard you give us a shout out on the show this morning." And he said, "I feel bad I didn't get back to you." So, hey, well, you're right. He's doing a great job. He has that he has that coaching paranoia in him for sure, because he was not going to answer that text without being sure who he was talking to.
Yeah, you got to be careful about that. Closing up here, just a couple things here. From the standpoint of two things here. Where do you see Bama right now, and particularly from the standpoint of lack of confidence in their defense, and with the remaining schedule, what's the road to success for them?
I mean, sort of like the other teams we were talking about, a loss to Tennessee this weekend certainly puts them in a difficult spot in terms of making the playoff. And, then they still have a trip to LSU coming as well. And Missouri in between there at home, which, will be eager to play better than it did against A&M. I think it was sort of inevitable that you were going to have some growing pains and some bumps in the road. And they're adapting to a new system. They're playing some young guys in the back end of the defense particularly, but really all over. And, it's taken a little bit. And, I think, they've, seems to me, although I'm not the expert, you would know, seems to me they've, relied on man coverage a lot. And sometimes they win, sometimes they don't. And, they have had some busts. But, Kane Womack, I think this week said, some of these calls that we're making that we're not executing as well as we'd like have worked in the past, and you have to stay with it. And I admire that commitment to the belief in your philosophy. I didn't take that at all as he was saying that I'm not going to adjust. I'm not going to tweak. I'm not, it was more of a mindset of we're going to continue to get better within this and execute it better. And, they'll have to do that because they have not played well for the last, 2 games. And really, one would argue 2 games and a quarter. It's not a secret what the problem is. It's getting off the field on 3rd and 4th down because they're sort of like, in some ways, if you look at Auburn's offensive stats, Auburn still ranks very well in terms of yards per play, but they give the ball away. Alabama, in terms of yards per play on defense, not really that bad, but they can't get off the field. Against Georgia, it was 4th down. Against Vanderbilt, it was 3rd down. It was a little bit of both, in South Carolina. So I think it's those critical plays that are really making the difference for them. But I also think that if you look at Kalen's history, typically in terms of coming out with the appropriate energy and the game plan to take advantage of wherever they might have advantages, he's got a really good track record of executing that, whether at Washington last year in both Oregon games and the Washington game against Texas in the playoff last year. And really, if you want to go back to the bowl game against Texas the previous year there, and then the first half against Georgia. And really even the bravado that he has, that he and Nick Sheridan coach with, like after, Georgia had him on the ropes and reeling and everybody in the place was wondering what's happening. And everybody's thinking, I'm sure from a football standpoint, you got to settle it down. You got to get a first down, just get the drive started. And instead he takes the top off with Ryan Williams and they score a touchdown. So I think the bravado with which, and swagger, if you will, with which he coaches serves them well in big games. So I would expect them to play better against Tennessee, but it is going to be a flurry of emotion because the disdain that those two have for each other, at least in terms of fan bases and the rivalry and all. It will be a cacophony of noise in Neyland Stadium, trying to get the balls off to big knockout punches early as they got a couple of years ago and forced Alabama to fight back in that great game the last time they were in Neyland.
Hey, Tennessee can't protect the quarterback. I mean, that's just the bottom line. You watch them against everybody they play. If it's not a pass on first down, they have some real issues. But closing up here, what would you say from your perspective as the old wishbone quarterback that's played so many big games here? What's the keys for Georgia against Texas?
They limit big plays, number one, because Texas has a lot of guys that can hit you quickly. Probably try to make a little more contact with the quarterback and not of the Kirby Smart Van Buren variety. And I joke because I know it was an accident. But although they haven't gotten the pressure maybe they would like, maybe Kirby shows that and say, see, this is what I mean about affecting the quarterback, affect him, at some place. But I think they need to try to get used seeing the rush a little bit. Secondary is going to have to play much better. And, I saw in some of your message boards there, Georgia, people complaining about missed tackles. So I kind of went and did a dive into our stats because, you see a few here and there. And, overall, the raw numbers, they're fine in tackling. But there have been some percentages that rank a little bit lower than you would expect in terms of, having opportunities to make tackles and having them broken or missed. And so I would say that, when you get a chance to get some of these dudes on the ground from Texas, you'd better do it. I mean, it's, it's like tackle attempts broken rate. The number of tackle attempts in a ratio broken, Georgia ranks pretty low. Now, does that mean a lot? I don't know. I've had Bill Connolly dive into it a little bit farther and said, really, it's just a couple of guys who kind of had some issues in that regard. But when Georgia has an opportunity to get their big play guys on the ground, they got to do it. And I would say that the other key is that Georgia has to be as effective throwing the football as they have, and it would certainly help if they'd be a little bit better running it. But I mean, they're dynamic passing. Texas hasn't seen anything like it, in terms of a veteran quarterback and the number of problems that Georgia can pose on offense. So I think it's going to be a great game. I think Georgia's got a great chance to win. Do I think Texas should be the favorite? Yeah, I do, but I'm not. I've seen way too much Kirby Smart football to think that Georgia goes into any game completely outmanned and with no hope. I don't buy that at all. I think it'll be a great football game.
Agree with you 100%. And I know you'll have a good time over there in Austin, and be a lot of Georgia fans coming to the game, and it'll be one of those things where all of us are going to be pulling hard for the Dogs. But always appreciate you being on with us, Rece, and keep up the good work on game day, and see if you can help Coach Saban. He needs a lot of help, doesn't he?
He's doing great. He's been a lot.
Really
a lot of fun.
He does like prep. It's obvious. He works at it hard. And
oh yeah, he's working. He's always working at it.
But some of that stuff that you and he do, you and I used to do up there in the red room, but they didn't used to have the telestrator and all. We just had to talk about it. We had a lot of fun.
They should have put a camera on us.
Yeah, we had a
camera on you.
Good philosophy there. That was good, and especially about the option football. So, all right, tell hello to everybody in the family, and keep up